This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome everyone to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam and I'm your host, and together we're helping take your leadership to the next level. And before we jump into today's podcast, I want to just mention, because I think this book is relevant to the conversation that we're going to have today, I want to mention a book that Richard wrote recently along with Rick Fisher, and it's called Your Next Pastor, a God-Centered Guide for Pastor Search Committees. And you'll see why that is relevant in the conversation to come. But I just wanted to leave that here at the top of the show. We'll leave links to this in our show notes. You can get it on Amazon, wherever you get books, but we'll also have it at blackabystore.org. So today's show is with Sean Morgan. It's a conversation he and Richard had. Sean is a nationally known coach who has developed a reputation for connecting ministry leaders and being a catalyst of fresh vision. He founded and curates cohorts at theascentleader.org. And as always, we'll leave links to his website in our show notes. This is a great conversation that focuses heavily on pastoral succession planning and really just churches in transition. Sean brings some great insights into this underserved area, I think, of the local church. Something that stood out to me is the percentage of churches that will be going through a leadership transition in the next few years. And it's just, I think it's north of 70% of churches. I may have those numbers off a little bit, but to me, it just highlights the need of the local church to better understand and prepare for leadership transition. So if you're a pastor, or if you know a pastor who is going to be facing a transition in the next few years, I think this is a great episode for you or for your pastor or church leader in general. As always, we'll have links to all of the information in the show notes. And again, this is just a fascinating conversation, and Sean just brings out so many insights into this area of leadership, mainly dealing with the local church, and I hope you'll be as blessed by this as I was.
Well, as you know, one of my favorite things to do on this podcast is interview interesting people who are influencing the kingdom of God. And we've got a special guest today who is named Sean Morgan. And Sean, I got to know him a while ago when I was on his podcast, and he was so interesting that I had to get him on mine. And so, Sean, welcome today.
Hey, Richard, it is an honor to be here. I've really been looking forward to it.
And Sean hails from San Francisco area out in California. And Sean, just go ahead and tell us what you do. Tell us about your organization and what you focus on, because I just find that so fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I started an organization called the Ascent Leader, and it's a small nonprofit that does cohorts for pastors. Most of our cohorts are 6 to 9 people. They're not online cohorts, they're physical cohorts. We were able, not only did we continue meeting throughout the pandemic, because we typically meet off the beaten path in homes and home environments like Airbnbs, we doubled in size over the course of COVID. And it really, I think, meets a need in leaders that leadership is lonely. We've heard that axiom, but leaders have friends and acquaintances, but they don't really have allies and confidants. And there's nothing like being a leader and under that pressure, and then meeting somebody who gets leadership, who does leadership, who's lived it, and maybe even occasionally a moment where somebody's in the exact same season of leadership as you are. Just the identicalness of certain aspects of the mantle, the burden. And that's what we try to do, is align leaders and cohorts around seasons. And so we do transitions leaders who are new, particularly new lead pastors of established local churches. We do church planters, right? There's only 2 ways to become a lead pastor. You either follow somebody or you start your own thing.
Yeah.
And so those are 2 of the verticals that we focus on. And then the third one we've started doing is executive pastors, which is sort of a hybrid leadership, but essentially like a chief operating officer of a ministry, because that's a heavy mantle in and of itself, even though it doesn't typically encompass the preaching side. So that's what the Ascent Leader does.
Okay. And now do you help churches in transitions as well? Like, are you more focusing on the pastor himself, or do you help churches when they're losing a pastor and getting a new one?
It's interesting. My intent, well, there was no strategy in this, first of all. I ended up helping new lead pastors after a baton pass in transition, simply because that's who all my friends were. And they were all lonely and isolated. And when nobody else was listening, they would tell me, like, this is crazy. I don't know what I'm doing. And so, but what I ended up realizing, Richard, is after the baton pass, I was learning things that needed to be done then in that moment, a year in, 2 years in the transition, but I was also learning things that should have been done beforehand. And so rather than just focusing on succession planning and sort of getting to that transition moment, which a lot of it is who you're going to hire, when's it going to be, that sort of stuff, I was learning there were deeply embedded cultural things that previous leadership often could have done something with and didn't. It could have been a blind spot or whatever in their leadership. And so I felt like over the years, I've now done this for 8 years, probably about 10,000 hours of my time in transition, that I've learned a lot about how churches should plan for and approach a pending transition as well. So I'm trying to do that in a way that serves the church. So we don't have cohorts for outgoing pastors at the moment, but we did build a course with a mutual friend of ours, Carrie Newhoff, a leadership course that helps lead pastors, both incoming and outgoing, partner together for succession. And the reason why we did that is there's roughly 320 to 340,000 churches in America. The average age of a pastor in America is about 58.
Really?
And most people, nobody has a crystal ball on this, but most people feel that about 50% of the churches in America will transition a lead pastor in the next decade. So depending on what number you're looking at, that's 160 or 170,000 churches over the next decade that will transition. And we feel like that is such an important thing to get right for the local church, that anything we're learning and doing that we can share with others and help others. So we put together a course which is actually called The Art of Pastoral Succession. And about 2/3 of that course is for the incoming lead pastor, and about 1/3 of that course is for the outgoing lead pastor. And that's how we strive to help the outgoing leaders plan for a pending transition.
Wow. Well, Sean, you've given me an opportunity to think of a zillion questions to ask you. And so let me maybe start with those cohorts for pastors, because I work half my time, I work with business CEOs, business executives, the other half with pastors. And it just baffles me. I mean, I love pastors. I love them. I invest a lot of time in helping them. But I'll deal with a guy who's leading a Fortune 500 company, and he'll have a leadership coach. He'll be going to seminars. He'll be reading books voraciously, trying to grow, get better. He's got, 100,000 or more employees. And then I'll try to help a pastor who's got 50 people, and he won't be able to navigate coming to a free conference on a Saturday just to try to help him grow as a leader. And there'll be a free lunch and 2 free books, and he'll live a mile away. And I don't know what it is, but it just seems that sometimes helping pastors who are, especially if they're struggling, I don't know why it can be so hard for people that they're wired to help people, but when it comes to receiving help, I don't know why it is pastors seem to have so many struggles with that. What have you found? How do you get these people signing up for your cohorts?
Well, we don't have that many clients. I mean, if there's 340,000 churches in America, and we have some in Canada, by the way, as you know, We have, at any given year, we have 100, maybe 120 clients. So just a small fraction. But what sets them apart is hunger. I do think, particularly planters and transitions leaders, there is something about the planting season where if you're a planter and you feel called to this, you're risking everything. Like this is your moment. And the same thing in a transitions leader. You typically, most transitions leaders have a decade or a couple decades of ministry underneath their belt. And so this is sort of a feeling like everything I've been doing has been preparing me for this. Like this is the moment. So there's a little bit higher degree of hunger. I think that helps. But what I will say, this is my opinion, so I don't really have any facts to back it up, but I don't think there is if the mantle of leadership is in church is a 10 out of 10, and I think it is. I think leaders in the church that are great leaders, I think, are the greatest leaders on earth. The dynamics of that, I think I can talk through. So it's a 10 out of 10 in my book. These are exceptional forms of leaders, and people who do it well are the best leaders that I know. I think the church values and equips their leaders at about a 3 to a 5. So the mantles, the demand is a 10, the need is a 10, the equipping is a 3 to a 5. I think there's a huge gap. And I would say, when you told me that you invite leaders to come for free, they're going to get engaged in some great content. There's going to be books. There's going to be people that they can lock arms with and learn from and converse with, and they don't show up. To me, there's something about they don't value what they have access to, and I think that's really difficult, because the local church deserves the best leaders in the world, the most innovative leaders, the most creative leaders. I'm not just talking about big L authoritarian leaders. I'm talking about just across the board talent. Yeah,
and certainly pastors that are struggling. There's their sense of self-worth, I think, sometimes is on the line of, this is my divine calling of God, and I'm not doing a very good job of it. Then that's hard to face, and it's easier to blame your people or your denomination or somebody else rather than look in the leadership mirror and say, how do I need to grow as a leader?
You hit the nail on the head there. When you're a leader of a local church, you are in a position of great power. I don't think the human heart is made for that kind of power and influence over people. Preaching God's word, the pulpit itself, but also we as humans have a tendency to create heroes out of our leaders. And that's true in the business world. I think it's more true in the spiritual, religious world. And if you're not careful as a leader, you become isolated. And so who then can speak in to your life? If you're not intentional about it, the answer is nobody will. If you look at Moses, he was leading millions of people, and who was speaking in to Moses? I mean, the voice of God occasionally, but on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, I don't think anybody was. It took Jethro, a pagan who had influence as his father-in-law, to really smack him upside the head, and it was one of the most catalytic leaps forward in Moses' leadership was Jethro's advice.
Well, before I was pastoring, before any great groups like yours probably existed, but I just kind of innately did that. Everywhere I've ever been as a leader, I've just pulled in people to say, hey, how would you like to meet on a regular basis and grow together? And, I've told people, I don't think I've ever been invited to a group like that. I've always just taken the initiative to, when I moved into town, to see who else there might be that was like-minded and wanted to join. And I got turned down several times. Interesting, when I became a pastor, I went around to some pastors to say, hey, how would you like to meet? The first two guys turned me down, but eventually I got a great group together that we became fast friends. And the guys who turned me down ended up out of the ministry and leaving their church. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. But something that I find too, when I think about transitions, I watched a lot of churches, and if a church is going to really grow to be great, there's not really necessarily a quick way of doing that. I mean, you just have to build in, you just have to put some years of solid leadership together in a row. And often that can mean a couple of godly leaders in a row, a couple of pastors who build upon what was left for them. And that's why I've always felt like transitions were so crucial, because my experience was you'll find a good pastor, he'll grow a strong church, and then he'll move on, and the church will make some kind of brain dead decisions. They'll call someone who's not a good fit at all, and the guy will be insecure because everyone talks about the former guy and how great he was. And the next thing you know, the next guy is kind of tearing down what took years to build. And instead of moving forward, building on that guy's shoulders, he tears it back down to the foundation, starts all over. And so I've seen so many churches that it's like you got to start all over again every time there's a new leader. Instead of growing and growing and building and building, it's always tear it back down to the foundation. We'll start over again. And so how do you help a church, or how does a pastor, if you sense maybe, I think I may be here 5-7 years, and then I'm sensing, God may have something else for me. What can you do to have that kind of transition where everything's not lost once you move on?
Yeah, well, what's behind that question is an exceptional perspective, which is there's always something there. If there's people there, if God's thumbprint has been there, there can be a lot of dysfunction today, but there's always something there that you can build on. Yeah. And exceptional leaders will not blow the whole thing up, but will seek to find that remnant and build on. And so I think what I would say would be that in a time of transition, there's always anxiety. What's going to change? So I'll plant a seed here. Is we did a study. It's actually available on our website, which should be in the show notes, theascentleader.org, and it's free. And it's the most expansive study on church transitions that I know of. It was a Barna study that CDF Capital, a church bank, put on to really study how churches are led after the baton pass in a transition. And so the first thing I would say, which is a word of encouragement, is that prior to, this is hundreds and hundreds of churches across America that are surveyed, prior to transition, only about 33% considered themselves healthy and growing. And by the 3-year point after transition, 75% considered themselves healthy and growing. So more than twice as likely. So transitions, the local church is today what it is 2,000 years after Christ because of transitions. Some good ones, some bad ones, but because of surviving and maybe even thriving through transition. So there's a word of hope, is we shouldn't be entirely fearful. Some things are going to change, but we ought to believe and trust that God's in that. The second thing I would add to that, after that word of encouragement, it goes back to what you said of what is it that is there that is not going to change? A lot's going to change, but what is it that is there within that church, within their culture, within their history, their norms and values? And these might not be stated. You might not be able to read these on the wall or on their website, but if you look, you should find some form of the Great Commission and the Great Commandment as part of what made this church great. It might not be last year. Maybe it was 100 years ago. Maybe it was 50 years ago. Some form of the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, which is love God and love others. And that's what will never change. We are Christ's bride, and we are on mission, and this work isn't complete until his second coming. So as we look back into our history, what can we see where people gave of themselves in extraordinary ways and selfless ways for the mission of the church, the Great Commission? And you may have to peel back the layers of the onion, but you've got to find those stories. You've got to find those people who can champion what will happen in the future, which the success of a transition is not in the moment. It's got to be the 5 to 10 year look. Is how do we look back in the past and see what God has done that paints a picture of the faith that we need to have to see what he will continue to do.
Now, I know there's different kinds of polities in churches, and so some pastors have a lot more say in how he's replaced. You can maybe select your successor, and others are very, very congregational, and it's just you finish your tenure and you leave, and the church will take it from there and find the next person. But my experience has been that there were some kind of commonly accepted ways of doing things, especially in congregational churches, which was a lot of my experience. That it was just because it was commonly accepted wasn't necessarily that it was biblical or even helpful. It's just what everybody did, And so, two things that I saw, and one was that there was this, and I think it probably speaks to any kind of transition, but there was this sense that whatever kind of leader you had before, the next guy needs to be very different, almost the opposite. So if your last pastor was really heavy on evangelism, then the next guy needs to be a discipleship guy, And if one guy was really good on building buildings, the next guy needs to be good on stewardship, trying to help raise money to pay for those buildings. But it was always, let's have the pendulum keep swinging back and forth. But the problem with that, I get it that if a pastor leaves, you probably need someone who's going to bring some different things to the table. If you needed someone who was exactly like the last guy, maybe God would just leave that guy here. But, so I get that. But for instance, if you've got someone and he's been at the church for 10, 15 years, and all the people who joined the church have joined because they like his style. They like the way he preaches. They like how he administers. And so you got a church filled with people who like and respond to a certain style. And then you go out and get someone with an entirely different style. It's a recipe for a disaster. And a lot of churches, that's exactly what they've experienced. How would any advice on if you're trying to help, a pastor, you don't necessarily need a clone, just like the guy that's leaving. But what would you say if someone's thinking about leaving a church is realizing we may need to do a transition here, and I know you've worked with some pretty high-profile guys that it's pretty hard to find a clone of some of the talented guys you're trying to replace or help replace. And so, what do? Do you just get someone totally different, or a pale, comparison to the original, or what do you do when you're, okay, we've had this kind of leader. Now, what kind of leader should we be looking for next?
Yeah, I think is a big challenge for a variety of reasons. Almost every church, because a pastor is preaching so much, they are the main personality and main face. You don't have to be a personality-centric culture to have the lead pastor, which is almost always the lead preacher, most frequent communicator, have that kind of influence on a church. So typically what you see is in their 40s and early 50s, a pastor is in their building years. And so they are up front more, and things are taking a shape around them more. Ideally, that needs to be tapered at some point. I tell most pastors, I think there's a diminishing return after the first 36 times or after, not the first, but after 36 times of preaching a year. So I think I would say you don't need to preach 48 times a year or 50 times a year. I think there's a diminishing return. So there is a way, I think, to
now, why would that be? So if you preach 36 times in a year, after that, why would there be a diminishing return?
Well, first of all, because not everybody comes every Sunday, right? So not all Sundays are created equal. So Christmas and Easter are going to be at the top, and July 4th and Super Bowl Sunday and New Year's Sunday are going to be at the bottom. So rather than just, preach other than your vacation, be preaching all the time. I think there's an opportunity to begin to help the church learn from other personalities and other voices. That's kind of where I'm going with it.
Okay.
And so I think you could look at, on a seasonal basis, what are the least attended services every year? And you're going to find 12 or 15 least attended. And so you want your lead pastor rested for Easter. You want them to they're going to have the most people in the room, the most people listening online on Easter and Christmas.
Okay.
So if they're preaching every other Sunday, how much margin are they going to have for those Sundays to be a little bit more prepared, a little bit more rested, a little bit more prayed up? So I would say, get strategic about the calendar and use, so that'll help your lead pastor, your main communicator, have a little bit more margin to invest in the higher attended Sundays of the year. I would say preaching consistently from when school starts in August for the next 4 to 6 weeks. I think you want your lead pastor preaching right there, because that's when everybody's settling into their fall rhythm. So give your pastor June and July off in terms of preaching or whatever, or just give them it off. But that season is way more important than the middle of summer or spring break in March, when there's a couple of Sundays where you're just going to have a regular attendance. So if you strategize around that, I think you help your lead pastor preach better on the bigger Sundays. But here's the key, going back to your original question, is it gives you an opportunity to bring in other communicators who can help teach the church how to learn from other voices and other styles. And so as a leader, I would say, who is our community becoming in 5 years? Like if we look at the demographic trends, and you can go on your school, like your county's website or your school system's website, and they'll have that stuff in there. What are the age and demographic style? I'm not just talking about age and race. I'm talking about income trends, marriage trends. Are people single or married? Do they have small kids in their homes? Like, who's moving into this town? Who are we becoming? And then as we look at those 15 other Sundays a year that we're going to have other people preach, how do we bring in people who can help us influence who our town is becoming 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? That's strategic leadership. You're taking opportunity to influence a church and help them grow. You're being strategic about influencing your community today and tomorrow, not just who was here last week. And hopefully you're also giving your lead pastor some rest in their preaching rhythm. So am I against them preaching over that much? No, I'm not against it. I just think there's a diminishing return from it.
Well, I've known a number of guys too that, preach series. And so when they finished a series, it was great to take a little bit of a break, let your associate preach or an outside speaker with a special focus. And you're developing that next series, and you're taking some time to really study and have a little break in between, and so very interesting. That's very interesting. Well, one other I think misconception I've seen is, and my dad did this years ago. He was old school pastor, and I mean he just did what was considered the appropriate thing to do. And that is, he served a Baptist church. It was very congregational oriented. And it was almost considered unethical to try to influence who they called when you left. It was like, I've discipled these folks, I've ministered to them, but now I'm leaving, and it's not going to be my church, and it's not an inherited, kingship like that you just sort of anoint your successor. And so he just didn't hardly do anything to help the search committee or anything. And it wasn't that he didn't care. It was like, that's how you did it. But the problem is that, most of the members had been saved under his pastoral leadership. The only pastor they'd ever known was my dad. And boy, were they shocked when they discovered that not everybody was pastored like he did, or preached. They just assumed, okay, we just get another pastor, and they're all like Henry, and the thing I've seen is, if you have been a pastor, I mean, if you've done a good job, like if you've done a poor job, and you've left the church in disarray, you probably don't need to leave any ongoing footprints. But if you've done a good job, you've grown the church, that you've hired the staff that are there, most of the people there are there under your tenure, then you probably know that church as well as anybody on the planet. And so you should kind of know what the issues are, the kind of leadership it's going to need. But so how do you do that? Especially if, you may have a polity that kind of says you have no authority to just go pick somebody. But are there ways for a pastor still to help their church so that they have a smooth transition in getting the next person?
Yeah, I think there's the key things would be like you're talking about in preparation for a change. And then the next question is, how do they steward their influence after the baton pass? So they're no longer the lead pastor. They're the former lead pastor, the prior lead pastor, or the pastor emeritus, or maybe they're just pastoring another church in another part of the world. What do they do there? And so I would say on the front end, you're absolutely right. This is a person, ministry is 24/7. You don't punch a clock and go home and stop thinking about ministry. So this is a person who's literally been immersed in ministry, and so is their family, for years and years and years. And yes, the elders or the search committee that's appointed, depending on the polity and what's all set up, they're going to dive in and have ownership over kind of the planning for that, maybe the selection and recruiting. But I think it's extraordinarily naive, whether your lead pastor is part of that group or not. It's naive to think that we don't want this person's input.
Yeah.
Now, I would also tell a church, I don't think, and I've seen all sorts of cases of this, that, and everything in between. But I think it's also unhealthy to expect your lead pastor to make all the decisions unilaterally. As an outgoing leader, I wouldn't want that kind of responsibility, because who are they going to blame if it doesn't go well in a year, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think it's really important to understand we're lay leaders and we're involved in this. Here's somebody, and we dial into ministry in different aspects of our week, a couple hours here, a couple hours there. But for the most part, ministry leadership stuff, we're probably 5 hours or less a month. That's probably a typical elder. 5 hours or less of your energy a month is really deep into church leadership. And then here you've got an outgoing pastor who's in it for years and years and years, pretty much 24/7.
Yeah.
Go to bed thinking about it, wake up at 2 a.m. thinking about it, wake up at 6 thinking about it. They do everything they can to go on a run or work out in the morning just not to think about it. So we absolutely want that person thinking about it. Maybe not even have to be approval, like, do they have to give their approval, yes or no? I don't know. Maybe that could work in some cases. But to listen to somebody, and I would even say their spouse, who can offer perspective that we could never have as board members and lay members on a committee like that, what an asset to enter into a conversation and let them influence that, where we can hold the weight of the responsibility and the decision, but we absolutely want perspective that only they can bring. I just think that's crucial.
The last two places I left, I just took it upon myself to basically write a summary of, during my tenure, and not so much what I did, but what I saw God do. And so God helped us do this, and God added a bunch of young, married couples, and God did this, and God did this. And as I've watched what has been happening, I'm sensing that we're going to need to address this in the future. And now that we got these people, we're going to need to do this. And so I'm not giving you all the marching orders. I'm just telling you, sort of in the driver's seat for the last number of years, this is what I've been seeing happen. And if I were to have stayed here, these are the things I feel like I would have needed to address in the future. And so, so that whoever you get next is probably going to, they don't have to be just like me, but they're going to have the capacity to minister to this kind of person. And, sometimes you see these pastor search committees, and they'll have a profile. We want someone who's between 35 and 40 and has one daughter and one son, and so they can minister to young families, whatever. And that gets kind of crazy. It's you want to say, Well, they just need to be able to minister to young families. Now, what age they are, I mean, I know, 55-year-olds are great at ministering to young families. And I know someone who is a young family who's too busy to minister to other young families. So you don't want to prescribe their age, but you do begin to sort of map out and say, but here's where this church is right now. And I've just found that to be a lot more helpful. And then, they take it from there, and they can reject what you suggested, or they can take it. But, Sean, I knew that our time was going to race by here, and there's just so many things that you're addressing that I think are just so important. But just as you work with pastors especially, is there anything else that you're seeing trends right now? I know certainly coming out of COVID, there's some pretty worn out, stressed out pastors who had to work through something they'd never had to deal with before. But just as you kind of see the lay of the land with pastors today, what are the issues that you're seeing kind of being fairly commonly experienced across the board these days?
I think pastors right now are coming out of 2022 encouraged, right? They just went through the pandemic. They've gone through high inflation, impending recession, and most of them, the financial picture has been strong. They're seeing re-engagement. I had a church in Toronto, near Toronto, call me 2 weeks ago and said that outside of Christmas and Easter, the third Sunday of January was their highest attended Sunday ever in the history of the church.
Wow.
So I am hearing glimpses of encouragement like that. At the same point, there is a tentativeness about the looming recession. And so I think leaders are once again feeling they're in a pinch with that. I think for me, though, what I would say is I would honestly throw all that kind of up into the wind, not throw caution into the wind, but throw those issues and just say, look, don't get too stuck on the end of the pandemic, what that all was like, or the looming recession, what that all may be like. The nature of a healthy church is a church that is on mission. Any organization like a church where its financial model is paid for by insiders and the decisions are generally made by insiders, I would say you're 10 years away from turning into a country club without leadership who drives culture forward with mission. And because of that tendency to be insider focused, we're going to vote for things that we like and make us comfortable. Leadership has to keep focused on mission, which means taking risks for the mission, for the sake of the gospel, reaching, baptizing, discipling. And so I would say, yeah, there's a lot of things going on that could be, in my opinion, distraction, regardless of whether we have a big recession coming or not. The mission of our church is more important now in either case than it ever has been. We have to stay ruthlessly on mission. And the only way that happens is from good leadership. It doesn't happen, you talked about congregational, it typically doesn't happen naturally from a congregation. We typically get the democratic needs of the congregation and results in a golden calf. It's leaders who keep people focused sacrificially on the mission. And so I would say just a renewed sense of what does that look like in your ministry, in your church, in your local context.
That's a great word. My dad used to say, if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. And if you ask a congregation, what do you all think we need to do? You're going to get the wrong answer most of the time because it will be comfort-centered, self-centered, not mission-centered. And
that's right.
But mission has a way. And, I found when you're mission-centered, even in a recession, the funds will be there. The volunteers will be there if it's for something that truly is important to the kingdom of God. But well, Sean, thank you for that. We're going to put all the contact information in the show notes, the resources. Sean is just a wealth of information and insight, and perhaps even you can join in one of the cohorts that he offers. I just feel like you don't want to be facing ministry and leadership alone these days. There's just too many ways to get discouraged when you're isolated and trying to just figure it all out yourself. And so I'm really encouraged to know what you're doing And hopefully some folks will get involved with that as well, participate, and gain from the valuable resources you're offering.
Yeah, we would love that. We'd love to serve people connected with you. So thank you for giving us a chance to talk about leadership and transitions. It's always a joy to feel like you and I got another conversation underneath the belt, and look forward to one of those days where we're in the same city at the same time.
I'd love it. Well, thanks so much, Sean, for joining us today.
It's an honor.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.